and what would you like to see in 2012? Sorry for not having warned you that I was going to ask you these questions, but I know that you're a very creative mind.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm really, really pleased to be here. And sort of a health warning is I haven't figured this all out in my own head, but I've spent so much time thinking about it this week. And it seemed to me that whenever I was sitting on a bus, I would end up reflecting on, did I imagine that I would be sitting on a bus in 1992? Not just whether I would still be doing this kind of thing, but is that what we thought we were building in 1992, that we would have to sit on so many buses to be having a conversation about how we all work together differently going forward. And with no disrespect to the organisers of this conference, I didn't expect to be sitting on so many buses, and it sort of became something that I'm going to have to process going away about how we organise these things going forward. I think that we were innocent in some ways in '92. It was almost an age of innocence. We didn't have the security issues of today, local, national, international, and Rio had its issues. And certainly the local police had very interesting conversations with us around security in the Parque Flamengo. And when the youth wanted to burn down the World Bank booth, of course the irony was that I was young and now I work for the World Bank, but when they wanted to burn down the booth, they went ahead and burned it down, and that was okay. But I think it was an age of innocence. It was also an age before the international connectivity that we take so much for granted now, which allows those people who are not here to be here, took hold. And I think that that fundamentally shapes and changes everything that you plan. In 1992, we were still sending telexes to governments, and then we were faxing, and then occasionally, actually civil society was emailing, but governments weren't. And we had the first real ability of civil society to mobilise using the internet really happened in PrepCon 3 and PrepCon 4. And that was the first time you really saw the first connectivity of southern-based civil society really influencing the negotiating agenda. So I think that when you look forward, you have to look to a very different kind of event with a different kind of feel. And I think that the question is, with only 18 months to go, how do we have a conversation with those people who are responsible for what is considered the formal negotiation? How do you talk about the concentric circles of space that are needed in order to move the conversation forward? So there needs to be quiet space for deliberation, and we need to work out who needs to be in that quiet space. The institutions of the United Nations, of Bretton Woods institutions, are still institutions governed by governments, represented by governments, notwithstanding how diverse the delegations are. And if that's the way it's still going to be in 18 months' time, how do you supplement that? How do you let the media in and out in a way which is helpful and constructive to the dialogue, not necessarily to the end result, but to the dialogue? And then how do you allow, and it's not just civil society, I think the breakthrough in Rio was this concept of special groups, which has been superseded, but the idea that there needed to be different representative voices present in the conversation. Still, 18 years later, we don't know how to have the private sector and government in a conversation at the right moment in time for it to work for either one of them. We haven't been able to construct spaces where it's easier for indigenous peoples to participate in processes. Women still feel like they have to caucus like hell to get 2 words in the convention documentation. So we've made a lot of progress in some ways, and then in other ways not. Which brings me to my really big takeaway, is that perhaps Rio and Rio are bookends of a particular moment in time. All of the aspiration in Rio was that at the international level we would find a unit of account that would influence regional and national decision making. And then that led to a lot of momentum in '93 with the creation of the Commission 1993, the Human Rights Conference in Vienna. Then in 94, there was a population conference. 95, there was a women's conference. 96 was Habitat. You had this momentum in the 90s that it was at the international level that we would find meaning and definition for those things that we were having trouble finding meaning and definition for at the national and regional level. And I've got a feeling that that time has come. And that we're very close now to have built negotiations and to build processes which are too complex. And there is something in the maxim of keeping it simple. And the complexity is now diverting us from what is important. And so the question that I do not have answered in my own mind is, how do we switch to something which is a little bit more simple in that it is focused, but it has to be participatory and it has to be open, that leads to a next cycle of negotiations, the next cycle of framing, the next cycle of defining challenge, but then defining what the solutions are. Despite, and this is my last point, despite how difficult Cancun has been, there is an energy and a practical nature to what needs to be done when you are outside the Moon Palace. And there's phenomenal energy in some of the things that are happening. And when you add all of that up, it isn't what we all hope for in international accord, but it really points to a direction where people are sort of referencing less and less the international agreement. I don't think that's really particularly good for the international community, but I think that the pragmatism of communities and the pragmatism of companies and the pragmatism of certain bureaucrats is very powerful. And so for Rio in 18 months, how do you celebrate that pragmatism? How do you create the space where lessons are learned and contacts are made? A lot of the things that are actually enshrined today are ideas which happened 20 years ago in small tents in a park on the edge of a beach in Rio. The relationships which now shape the discussions, the relationships which endure when countries are pitted against each other, are relationships that were made in a park in Rio 18 years ago, or were made in the conference centre. So that is very important. In Rio, we come back together again, and a new generation connects, and a new generation frames debate. But I think that energy, influence, impact will be defined perhaps more at the local and national level. The question for the international system is, should Rio again aspire to the whole being more than the sum of the parts? Or do we honestly think at this particular moment in time, in the absence of political leadership almost everywhere, that we shouldn't frame Rio that way? We should frame Rio at a celebration, bottom up, of what we are all capable of in the absence of political leadership. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think that that will be important in the design of Rio, and it will be important in the way in which we gather in Rio. Now remember, in Rio, we weren't happy to be 40 kilometres away from Yolanda. We were in the park, and she was in a conference centre. We weren't happy, but we made it work. But by the time we got to Rio, we only had 140 square brackets left. You need people like Yolanda in these events if they are to stand a chance of succeeding. And so, for the next generation of Yolandas, this is your time.